There are nights in NASCAR when the race itself is only half the story, and what happens after the checkered flag ends up shaping the conversation for weeks. San Diego just gave us one of those nights. A 23-year-old driver climbed out of his car as a Cup Series winner for the first time in his life, and within minutes, a single sentence from a teammate turned a celebration into a debate that's still spreading across the entire garage. Stick with me through this one, because by the end you're going to have your own opinion on whether this was innocent, intentional, or something in between, and honestly, the answer might surprise you. Let's set the scene properly. San Diego wasn't just another stop on the schedule. It was a street course that demanded precision, patience, and nerve, and it produced exactly the kind of finish that reminds people why they fell in love with this sport in the first place. Heim, still early in his Cup Series journey, found himself in the position every young driver dreams about and very few actually reach, leading laps late, with a legitimate contender breathing down his neck, and no safety net if he made a single mistake. That contender was Bubba Wallace. And if you know anything about how Wallace races, you know he doesn't back off. He was pushing, probing for any opening, using every lap to apply pressure. For a rookie-level Cup driver, that kind of heat late in a race is exactly the scenario that exposes nerves. It's the moment where inexperience usually shows itself. A driver drifts wide defending a line they shouldn't be defending, brakes half a second too early, or panics under the mirror pressure. None of that happened. Heim drove like someone who had done this 100 times before, even though he hadn't done it once. He protected his line, managed his tires, and crossed the finish line as a Cup Series race winner for the very first time in his career. By every measure, that should have been the entire headline. A young talent announcing himself on one of the sport's biggest stages, holding off a former Daytona 500 winner in a straight fight to the finish. That's a career-defining afternoon, full stop. Except it didn't stay that simple. According to Heim's own account, once both drivers were out of their cars and the immediate adrenaline of the finish had started to fade, Wallace walked over. The interaction began the way you'd expect. A handshake, a congratulations, an acknowledgement of the accomplishment. Then, according to Heim, Wallace added something along these lines, that he should enjoy this moment, because wins like this don't come easily or often. On paper, read in a vacuum, that's a fairly ordinary thing for a veteran to say to a younger driver. Cup Series wins are rare. Even excellent drivers can go entire seasons, sometimes entire careers, without one. There's nothing inherently wrong with reminding someone of that. But context changes everything, and tone changes everything. Heim didn't hear it as a neutral observation about how hard racing is. He heard it, at least in the moment, as something closer to a suggestion that this win might be a fluke, a one-time thing, rather than the start of something real. Think about how loaded a moment like that already is emotionally. You've just achieved something you've worked your entire life for. Every ounce of your focus for years has been building toward exactly this outcome. Your adrenaline is still spiking, your emotions are raw and unfiltered, and you're trying to process what just happened in real time. And then, right in the middle of that, a teammate says something that could be read as doubting whether you actually belong at this level. Even if that wasn't the intention behind it, it's not hard to understand why it landed the way it did. What's genuinely impressive here isn't the win itself. It's how Heim responded to the moment afterward. He didn't turn it into a confrontation. He didn't call Wallace out publicly or frame it as disrespect. When reporters asked him about it, he was remarkably composed. He acknowledged that the comment stuck with him, that it bothered him in the moment, but he also made a point of saying he respects what Wallace has built and earned in his own career. That's not the reaction of someone looking to create drama. That's the reaction of someone who understands that how you handle adversity, even small, ambiguous, emotionally charged adversity like this, says more about your future than any single race result ever could. And here's the part that really stood out to me. Instead of getting defensive or dwelling on whether the comment was meant as an insult, Heim basically turned it into motivation. His attitude, in essence, was that people are always going to have opinions about whether a driver belongs or doesn't belong, whether a win is legitimate proof of talent or just a lucky break, and that the only real answer to those opinions is performance. Not arguing, not explaining, just winning again, and then winning again after that, until the questions answer themselves. That's a mature outlook for any athlete, let alone one still building his reputation at the highest level of the sport. Now let's talk about the other side of this, because it would be unfair to only look at it from Heim's perspective. Multiple people connected to the team have since suggested that Wallace's comment had far less to do with Heim personally and far more to do with Wallace's own frustration about how the race played out for him. The suggestion is that Wallace felt his own race, and by extension, an opportunity for his side of the organization, slipped away because of decisions made during the event, whether that was strategy, timing, or simply how the laps unfolded. If that's accurate, then what Heim interpreted as a shot at his legitimacy might actually have been Wallace venting about his own missed opportunity, with the timing and delivery just landing badly. That's worth sitting with for a second, because anyone who's competed at a high level in anything understands how raw those first few minutes after a loss can be. Adrenaline hasn't settled. Disappointment is still sharp. And when you're that close to a win, close enough to see it, close enough to feel like it was within reach, the frustration doesn't always come out clean. Sometimes it spills over into a comment that wasn't really about the person it was directed at. It was about the moment. Bubba Wallace has never been a driver who hides his emotions well, for better or worse. That's part of what makes him compelling to watch, but it's also exactly the kind of personality trait that can turn a private frustration into a public talking point. What makes this whole situation more complicated is that Wallace hasn't addressed it directly himself, at least not publicly, in the immediate aftermath. That silence leaves fans working with an incomplete picture, Heim's account of what was said and how it felt, filtered through second-hand explanations from people around the team trying to soften the moment. Without Wallace's own words on the record, everyone watching is essentially filling in the gaps based on their existing opinion of both drivers. If you already see Wallace as fiercely competitive and emotionally direct, you probably read this as harmless venting. If you're inclined to see rivalry or tension building within the organization, you probably read it as something sharper. That ambiguity, frankly, is exactly why this story has legs. There's no definitive villain here, no clean answer, just a moment open enough to interpretation that it forces people to reveal what they already believe about the two drivers involved. And that's often how the most interesting storylines in this sport develop, not through obvious controversy, but through small, ambiguous moments that fans and analysts spend days debating because there's no official resolution. Let's zoom out for a second, because the actual racing here deserves just as much attention as the post-race exchange. A first Cup Series win is one of the most significant milestones in any driver's career. It's not just a trophy or a stat line. It fundamentally changes how a driver is perceived, both by the garage and by himself. Teams start looking at a driver differently once he's proven he can close out a race under pressure against elite competition. Sponsors take notice. Media coverage shifts, and maybe most importantly, the driver's own internal belief about what he's capable of tends to shift as well. There's a difference between believing you can win and actually having done it, and Heim just crossed that line in front of everyone. The real test now isn't San Diego. It's everything that comes after it. Any driver can point to a single strong run and call it proof of arrival. The harder, more meaningful proof comes from what happens next. Whether this becomes the first entry in a growing list of wins, or whether it ends up being remembered as an outlier, a great day that never quite repeated itself. That's the question Heim now has to answer, not with interviews or explanations, but with results on the track over the coming weeks and months. And ironically, if Wallace's comment really was intended the way Heim initially took it, as a suggestion that this win might not be repeatable, it may end up backfiring in the best possible way for Heim. Nothing motivates a competitive athlete quite like being underestimated. If anything, that exchange might be remembered down the line not as a moment of tension, but as the spark that pushed a young driver to prove a point every single week afterward. There's also a broader lesson buried in here about how emotionally charged the moments right after a race really are, for everyone involved, winners and losers alike. We tend to only think about the emotional toll of losing, the frustration, the second-guessing, the what-ifs. But winning carries its own intense emotional weight too, especially the first time. You're processing joy, relief, exhaustion, and validation all at once, which means your emotional radar is running at maximum sensitivity. A comment that might roll off your back on an ordinary day can suddenly feel loaded with meaning in a moment like that. It doesn't mean the interpretation was wrong. It just means both drivers were operating in one of the most heightened emotional windows either of them will experience all season, and that context matters just as much as the words themselves. So where does this actually leave things heading into the next few races? Heim has already shown, through both his driving and his public response, that he has the composure to handle pressure from multiple directions, on the track, fighting off a veteran competitor, and off the track, navigating an ambiguous comment without letting it define his moment. That combination of skill and maturity is exactly what separates drivers who have won great race from drivers who build lasting careers. Wallace, for his part, still has an opportunity to clarify his intentions publicly if he chooses to, which could either quiet this story quickly or, depending on what he says, add another layer to it. Either way, this moment isn't disappearing anytime soon. If Heim goes on to win again in the coming weeks, this exchange will almost certainly get brought back up as an early example of doubt turning into fuel. And if he doesn't, people will point back to this same conversation as evidence that maybe the skepticism had a point. That's the strange thing about moments like this in sports. Their meaning isn't fixed the day they happen. It gets rewritten by everything that comes after. What do you think actually happened here? Do you read Wallace's comment as a genuine dig, intentional or not? Or do you think it was simply raw frustration from a driver who felt a win slip through his fingers? And more importantly, do you think Corey Heim just kicked off the first of many Cup Series victories? Or was San Diego a peak he'll have a hard time reaching again? However you see it, thank you so much for spending this time with me and going through this story in detail. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you'll join me again for the next one.